All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to learn more about helping clients through grief and loss. This is the clinical training portion. So we'll take a deeper dive into specific work in a counseling setting with individuals and families going through a grief or loss experience. So let's jump right in. Okay, so first we want to touch on what impacts a person's grief reaction. In the general grief training, we talk about all the different types of reactions that a person might have. So we're not going to do that again here, but really start to think about what impacts how a person grieves and how they present. And we have a list here, but of course there are so many reasons. But we have to look at first and foremost historical antecedents. So what that means is what historically has happened for their culture, their race, their context. A lot of times, we forget how grief can be kind of a genetically inherited thing. There's a lot of research being done on that, just the biological transfer of a lot of different traumatic experiences that also includes grief. And so if we look at how different members of society have been treated over time in their grief or in their trauma, we can see how that impacts them now today. The second is personality variables, age, gender, coping style, attachment style. If they have a different attachment to the person who died versus the people who are still living, maybe they were anxiously attached or avoidant, that can definitely change how they are grieving that person. Cognitive style, so meaning like, are they a person who is, let's dig in and get this done, very like performative, or are they more kind of go with the flow, laissez-faire with it? And how they handle things cognitively in a general sense can impact how they grieve as well. Self-esteem and self-efficacy, how confident do they feel in overcoming hard things? And how do they feel about themselves can definitely change or affect how they are grieving. And of course, beliefs and values. We talk about that a lot in the clinical world, but especially with grief, we want to explore their beliefs and values surrounding life and death and everything in between. The next is social variables. How much support are they getting from other people in their life? And are they satisfied with that? Or do they feel isolated or alone? Or do they feel like they can't talk about their grief, or it's not understood or respected? Social role involvements. So what is their role in their family, in their job? What is their position, and what was the position of the person who died? That can definitely make an impact. Religious resources and ethnic expectations. Again, these are things that have been long-term impacting people and how they grieve, how they view death, how they feel like they can talk about death or their loved one's death. And a lot of our cultural or ethnic variables can impact that. And so thinking about and exploring that with the client. Concurrent stresses, that can be so many different things. Maybe there's law enforcement involvement. Maybe there's some litigation that's happening. Maybe the person who died was, in a conflictual relationship with them. Maybe they are now a single parent, and that's really stressful. So this can be so many different things, but just the compounding of stressors that can change how a person reacts to a loss. This is a big question. When should grief counseling be done? So research shows that at earliest, a week following the funeral. We have had people, of course, come prior to their loved one's death, and we can start to do, just some of that work. But, of course, we want to give space for that person to process those initial responses to death. And so General rule of thumb is a week following, but of course, if you have a relationship pre-existing, we can contact them and offer support. Here at Calm Waters, sometimes we'll do a consultation or at least a check-in over the phone, but we want to give them space to kind of process through any shock or numbness or just the big emotions that come directly following. It's not usually the best time to do any kind of deep work, but wanting to, of course, be a support. And of course, in early grief, we aren't doing that big deep work. We're doing a lot of self-care and coping skills. You know, are you drinking water? Are you eating healthy? Are you eating, 3 times a day? It doesn't have to be big meals, but just something. A lot of times that self-care is the first thing to go. And so we want to talk about that a lot and make sure that they are engaging in that. And just coping skills. Are you getting outside and maybe even just sitting in the sun or going for a walk to move your body? Finding ways to take care of themselves in that early grief is going to be more important than any deep work, because ultimately, their mind and body and emotions are probably not ready to go to the deeper level beliefs work or values in that early grief. Who should receive grief counseling? So not everyone needs grief counseling, and honestly, most do well without, but it's most often effective to seek services once there is, quote unquote, enough difficulty and reach out for help. What is enough difficulty is totally subjective, but if that is what they feel like they need, then they should seek counseling. There's no evidence to show that just because somebody has experienced a loss that they need counseling and would benefit. So until they perceive that they would benefit, that's when we see the most effective treatment. So really forcing someone to do it is not going to be helpful. You see that a lot with, parents and children, that they just want to make sure they're okay. But not really having any major issues, or, teens not really wanting to even open up or feeling ready to. So those are not usually the most opportune times to have somebody start counseling. We really want them to be invested and involved. And we talk a lot about that with parents, but also for adults. It's not just a place you feel like you need to be, but that you want to be. And then, of course, preventative measures that can take place and be effective, if somebody's at risk. So maybe they don't have a whole lot of difficulties right now, but we see a lot of things that we consider at risk for having complicated grief. We'll talk about that in a minute. But sometimes getting started, because we see those factors, can be helpful. But again, we do need buy-in from the client who is being treated. So what makes someone at risk for difficulties? We see that as somebody who doesn't feel supported by their social network, whether that be an actual lack of support or perceived lack of support. So sometimes there's, people showing up with food, showing up to their house right after, but maybe it's not the type of support they feel like they need, or maybe they've received some negative messages or unhelpful things. And so they just don't feel supported in their loss, or they might actually not have support. They may be isolated, maybe geographically, but also emotionally. Maybe they are part of that disenfranchised grief, where they don't feel like their grief matters to others or is worth talking about, or that they can talk about it. And so feeling really isolated can definitely put someone at risk for difficulties in their grief experience. Traumatic circumstances of the death can definitely cause additional challenges, especially if they were there or received a lot of details about the person's death. So we want to make sure that those folks are receiving services as well. The presence of concurrent life stressors, we talked about this one. It's really hard to give space to your grief and your feelings if you are consumed by other stressors. And so sometimes therapy can be a space where this is the hour they talk about their emotions. This is the time that they give to themselves and prioritize themselves. And we can help them kind of navigate, how do I cope with all of this stress amongst all of my grief as well. Having more young children at home also complicates and can make somebody more at risk for difficulties in their grief, because they have to, a lot of times, they will say this, but be strong for their children. And there's just a lot of, role challenges that go into this. Maybe their partner died or their co-parent died, and now they're a single parent trying to figure out how to navigate, finances and childcare and all of the different things that go along with having young children at home. Having high levels of anger, longing, or self-blame. So these are really high, maybe intense emotions that we see. And when we see them at a high level, it's really hard to cope, and definitely can complicate grief if we're very, very angry or blaming ourselves for what happened, or just that yearning that causes us to feel empty and like we don't want to go on. Okay, so there's a couple models we're going to talk about as just foundational pieces of approaching grief therapy. In the general training, we did talk about Worden's tasks of mourning, but we're going to dig into it just a little bit deeper here. Again, they're listed out as accepting the reality of loss, adjusting to an environment that's different, working through the pain of grief, and finding an enduring connection while embarking on a new life. So we're going to dig into these a little bit deeper in the context of a therapy setting. But again, these are not a stepwise process. These are tasks that we will return to time and time again along our grief journey. The second that we're going to talk about is the dual process model of coping with bereavement. So in this model, we have a loss-oriented part of bereavement and restoration-oriented, and all of these happen every day. You can see the everyday life experience is encompassing both pieces of that. And there's that zigzag line going back and forth between loss-oriented and restoration-oriented. And that is because every single day, a person will experience both and should experience both. Loss-oriented has to do with the stress of grieving. Sometimes that feels intrusive. Sometimes, like, we're not trying to think about it, but it just comes to us. Sometimes that's intentional, like I am trying to work through this pain of grief, and really trying to sit in it and feel it and experience it. And I'm not wanting to look at the future, but I'm wanting to sit here in my grief. And so that's loss oriented. We're really focused on what I have lost, who I have lost. Restoration oriented has to do with future. So I'm attending to life's changes. I'm doing new things. Maybe I'm distracting myself from grief or avoiding it in some way. I'm trying to find my new identity, my new relationships, maybe new roles and patterns. And so when we look at this dual process model of bereavement, the most important thing is that both are necessary. We want to and need to experience both. And a lot of times clients might have concerns about this, that am I not addressing my grief enough, or am I too focused on the future? And really there's not one right way, but helping them find a balance. And so sometimes we need a break. Sometimes we need a break from our grief, our feelings, our loss, and that's okay. And sometimes, we can't just be all focused on the future, but we have to deal with the pain that we're feeling. And so all of this is very normal. And it's just balancing both of those, because we have to do both in order to grieve. Okay, so we're going to get into more of the nitty-gritty of counseling with grieving families. Overall, the goal is to help client adapt to the loss of a loved one and be able to adjust to a new reality without them. So as we do this, we're taking into account those 4 tasks of mourning as well as the dual process model. So for the 4 tasks of mourning, we can kind of parcel out these as different goals for our counseling process. Again, increasing the reality of the loss, helping the client overcome various impediments to readjustment after the loss, helping the client deal with both emotional and behavioral pain, and helping them find a way to maintain a bond with the deceased while feeling comfortable reinvesting in life. So while this is outlined as 4 tasks of mourning, you see both. You see both that dual process model, the restoration focus, right, reinvesting in life, while you also have that loss focus where we're dealing with the pain. So we see both of these models throughout, and we should be focusing on both of them. So we can look at our first goal, increasing the acceptance of the reality of the loss. Now, some clients might come to us past this goal. They may have already achieved this, accomplished this, and so we can talk about it to assess where they're at, but we might not need to do a lot of work here depending on when they're coming in along in their grief journey. So we do this by helping them actualize the loss. So talk about it, asking questions. Where did it occur? How did you find out? Who told you? Where were you when you heard? What was the funeral like? What was said at the service? And they might need to go over these details multiple times. And so we say, do it as many times as you need to. If they're still in disbelief, if they're still having a hard time grasping the fact that their loved one has died, let's go over it again. The more times they can talk about it, the more they can internalize and incorporate that into their own narrative and have that reality kind of set in. Sometimes also visiting a gravesite or a place where maybe their remains are scattered or kept can help that actualization of the loss. So the second goal, overcoming impediments to readjustment after the loss. So this is helping them live without the deceased. That person probably played some sort of role in their life, and so they will have an adjustment to make. This has to do with helping them problem solve. Who's going to pick up the kids? You know, if it was the person who always picked up their children from school, this is a new change that we have to make and we have to figure out. So helping them problem solve that. Or maybe there's other things that they have to deal with that was part of the other person's role who is no longer with us. And so figuring out and getting creative to help them problem solve and helping them feel confident that they can. A lot of times it feels so overwhelming that I will never be able to figure this out, or I don't have the support to figure this out. We want to help them problem solve as much as we can and help them build that decision-making skill. A lot of times they're coming in and trying to figure out how to make decisions, maybe because it was a partnership or maybe because they always had a co-parent they were trying to kind of navigate that with, but helping them feel more confident in their decision-making skills as well. And of course, providing time to grieve. This is gradual. A lot of times people want to speed through this part. And time does not heal all wounds. I am not saying that, but there is something to say about providing time and being realistic that you can't just, you know, flip a switch and have everything figured out. We can't just fast forward through this period of time, but time will, you know, afford different opportunities to figure things out. And so, of course, those firsts, the first anniversaries and holidays and things like that are expected to be really hard, but that doesn't mean that it ends after that. So just giving them some realistic kind of feedback and information about what grief looks like and encouraging them to take time as they need it. Goal number 3 is processing through the pain of loss. And so this involves helping them identify and experience their feelings. And so this doesn't mean just stating them or expressing them in order to just get through it, get over it, right? If I say my feelings and look, I'm talking about it, right? But instead really sitting in and exploring their feelings, because they need to feel it in order to understand it and in order to process it and overcome it. A lot of times we hear anger, guilt, anxiety, or helplessness and sadness. And so really trying to help them explore this. Some people might be really angry and over-identifying with anger. Some may be not angry when they should be. And so really just kind of helping them explore both sides of that, the positive and the negatives, and the positives and negatives and anger they may have about the person who died. We can't just be, rose-colored glasses about that. We do need to address both the good and the bad of those things that we are feeling. With guilt, we hear this so much, all of the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, and what ifs, maybe about ourselves, maybe about other people. And so really trying to help our clients challenge or reality test the guilt they may be feeling. Maybe they're outwardly putting that, or maybe it's all happening internally and they're putting that on themselves, but really being able to help them verbalize and process and experience and challenge that guilt that they're feeling. With anxiety and helplessness, a lot of times people fear that they cannot survive without their loved one. And so they need a little encouragement and, through cognitive restructuring, figuring out ways that they have managed through something really hard before and that they can manage through something like this. So helping them figure out what is that anxiety, what is that fear or helplessness, and how can they challenge that within themselves and cope as that comes up. Sadness, of course, to be expected with grief. And so we really want to provide an opportunity for people to express all of their feelings, especially sadness. Sometimes we have people that say that, crying is a weakness or being sad isn't going to get me anywhere. And so we really want to explore what are their beliefs about sadness, but all emotions, and help them realize how helpful and meaningful their emotions can be. The next part of processing the pain of loss is helping them find meaning. For some people, it's doing something with a purpose, like giving back or starting a scholarship fund or a philanthropy or something related to their loved one's death. Sometimes it is just getting involved in something that already exists, but really finding purpose or meaning and making meaning from what happened to their loved one, even though they can't necessarily change it, but maybe they can change something for someone else or reinvest back into the world something that is really meaningful to them. The next part is helping to interpret and redefine normal behavior and allow for individual differences. We often have families, and of course, families are groups of individual human beings, and so every individual is going to experience something differently, and that includes grief. A lot of times people within families have different ways of grieving, which can create conflict, or they can interpret maybe themselves as being crazy or, something negative because they are having a much harder time than other people in their family. And sometimes, people aren't grieving the way that they quote unquote should be per other family members. And so helping them realize that grief looks different and there is no one normal. And then of course, looking at any defenses or coping styles that they might be having, whether healthy or unhealthy, assessing for drug or alcohol use, any avoidance or distractions, self-blame, other things that might be might not be effective long-term, so that we can find more helpful and healthy coping skills moving forward. So the fourth goal is finding an enduring bond with the deceased and reinvesting in life. So this has to do with facilitating an emotional relocation of the deceased. So how else can their loved one be a part of their life, while still allowing them to move forward in relationships? A lot of times we hear that it feels like they're dishonoring their person if they, maybe if it was their friend that died, they make a new best friend, or their spouse that died, they start dating again. There's a lot of guilt that goes along with that and a lot of dishonor. And so how can we create a new role for that person to still be a part of their life, but still allow space for another person to step in, or a new relationship to step in? So maybe that person becomes kind of a guiding light, so to speak, or somebody who kind of gives them advice internally, thinking about what they would have said or done, or some other way for them to still be a part of their life in a healthy and helpful way, and still allow them to make new relationships. And finding ways to honor that person. How can they honor their memory? Maybe by wearing something of theirs, whether that be a piece of jewelry or clothing, or saying I love you every morning or every night, or any other. There's so many different ways that a person can honor their loved one, and so helping them find a way to still feel connected and still feel like they're honoring that person and their memory and who they were to them. And then helping them identify personal goals without their loved one. Sometimes, when someone dies and that person was so special or integral in their life, it's really hard to think of life without them. And so figuring out, who are you as an individual, and who are you still, who was that part of that relationship, and how can you still invest in those goals, but also individual goals. Even asking, what would you want for yourself if your grief was magically removed? And working with them to articulate and identify, who am I without this person? And so figuring out what, that might be doing some values work, that might be doing identity work, but a lot of times trying to kind of align our goals and ourselves with who we are as an individual, rather than a person in a relationship. Another goal I think is important to highlight, not necessarily part of the Wharton's tasks of mourning or dual process model, but it definitely applies to both. Maybe processing the pain of grief and doing that grief work. But the window of tolerance. So we talk a lot here at Calm Waters about grief being a wave, that waves come and go. And sometimes we feel like we are doing okay, we're swimming, we're making it through. And then all of a sudden, this wave comes crashing down on us, and we feel like we can't breathe, we can't tread water, we can't swim, and we're just drowning. And so those grief waves, like we talked about in the general training, comes with any reminders, which can be any of our five senses: sight, smell, touch, sound, taste, can just kind of pop into our mind, and all of a sudden we're flooded. Or it can be a holiday or an anniversary. There's lots of different reasons why these waves come. And so it's so important when they do come that we feel confident that we can deal with it, that we can navigate it. And so we don't want to be in that hyper arousal where we're very vigilant and have intense reactions or overwhelming emotions. We also don't want to be in this hypo-arousal where we're shut down, we're numbing out, disconnected, maybe feeling shame or overgiving and can't say no. So we don't want to be too high or too low. And so we don't want to be in that, we're constantly drowning. We also don't want to be in, we're just laying there floating in the sea. So we have to kind of tread water and swim. And that's where we are in between that window of tolerance. That we have time to think, we have time to feel, and we can cope, and we can bring ourselves up when we need to, or bring ourselves down when we need to. And so finding coping skills, emotion regulation skills to come back to that window of tolerance is a lot of that early work in grief when we're seeing clients. Okay, so as far as phases of treatment goes, we have our early and assessment phase. Of course, we're doing our typical BPSS assessment, ruling out medical issues, setting up a contract and alliance to get buy-in, and discussing memories. You know, it's a really helpful tool to talk about tell me about this person. What did you like most about them? What's your favorite memory about them, and really just kind of getting to know who that person was and how they describe them can be really informative. It can also be helpful to talk about maybe what they don't miss about them. I mean, that sounds harsh, but it's really important for a person to be able to address both the positive things, the things they loved about their person, but also to not hold them on the pedestal of, you know, they were perfect, they did no wrong, because they're human. There were things that were annoying or disappointing, or you know, things that they're like, well, you know, I don't have to hear them snore anymore, right? Even something small like that. But we don't want to have them idealize their loved one, because that's going to put kind of a roadblock, but we can work with it, right? And so here we're just assessing. So we're asking about their loved one, both positive and negative things about them, and exploring that a little bit. And then also for assessing and exploring a linking object. And so a linking object is not necessarily something we hold on to because we remember our person by it, but something that we need to have, because I feel so anxious and lost without it. So it's more of like a what's the reason behind this keepsake or this thing that I have? If they are holding something, having something because they feel anxious and stuck without it, that's just an indicator that there's some work to be done. If it's something that they just, you know, have because they, you know, it brings them joy, but not necessarily anxiety if they don't have it with them, again, just something to note. What we see often is if somebody has those linking objects where they feel really anxious, if they don't have it at the start of treatment, we can use that as a guide to kind of tell us a little bit about how they are doing without even really talking about it. You know, are they coming with it less? Are they parting with it more? And so it's just kind of an indicator of how they're doing in their grief. So that's assessment in early phase. Middle phase, all the things we talked about, right? Providing support for the tasks they're struggling with. So we're assessing, you know, where are they? Where do they need the most support? Where do they need the most intervention? Is it in acceptance? We need to start there. Or do they have a whole lot of things they're adjusting to, and that's where we need to start? They need some routines, they need some boundaries, some balance in their life again. Or is it doing that deep, hard work of working through the pain? Or do they feel lost and they just really need to figure out how to find a support system and still feel connected to their loved one? So you're kind of assessing which of these pieces they need the most support right now and what's the most critical, and they'll probably tell you. But if they don't, just helping them kind of guiding them to what might be the most helpful to start with and moving from there. But most likely it'll be at least a couple of these. End phase. So towards the end of treatment, we really want to set them up for success in navigating life of grief, right? Because grief is lifelong. And so we want them to have a support system. We want them to have relationships that they can access and utilize when they need to. And so really helping them identify, you know, supports. That could be a support group, that could be people in their family. It could be a new group of people who they've really connected with through their grief. And so really empowering them to find people who they feel understood by, and knowing that it might not be the people that they had in their life before their loss. A lot of people don't feel as confident or comfortable going back to, a group of couples who they're really close with, but now they're the only single person because their partner died. And so figuring out who are the people that you can lean on for your grief, and who are the people maybe that are there to support you, but you maybe don't utilize that support in that type of way. And then challenging or facilitating healthy beliefs about grief ending. A lot of people come in wanting to know, when is this going to be over, or what do I need to do to get through my grief? And it's a hard fact that grief is lifelong. There is no getting over it. It's learning how to carry it in a way that you feel stronger, and the pain doesn't drown you as much each time. So we really have to challenge that belief that it ends. And we love this quote from WandaVision, but what is grief if not love persevering? And I think that's so beautiful because, we grieve because we love, and the amount of love that we had for our person, is so intense. And of course, our grief is going to be so intense. So I think it's important to, share that with clients, that grief is not going to end, and it's a symbol of your love continuing. Okay, last thing we're going to touch on is the evaluation of progress in treatment, because it is so hard. If grief is lifelong, how do we know when grief therapy is done? And really, it's a subjective experience, talking with your clients, figuring out, how are you feeling now compared to when you started? Are you feeling stronger in carrying your grief? Like, what to do, how to come back to that window of tolerance. And so some of it is just a subjective experience, but also behavioral changes. You can do assessments and identify that based on, reduction in behaviors, but even, what are you as a therapist noting? What is the client reporting? And so using that as kind of an indicator of how progress is going, but also symptom relief. Same kind of thing. If you want to do a PHQ-9 or a stress scale, figuring out, how are we doing now compared to where we started, can be a really helpful indicator of progress as well. So that is all for this section, and we will come back and do more about specific interventions with clients going through grief.